Hey everyone, and welcome to the Ethnically Podcast, the show dedicated to amplifying diverse voices in every industry across society. Have you ever felt like your story wasn't being told? Here at Ethnically, we celebrate the journeys of those who defied expectations and carved their own path. We delve into the unique experiences of ethnic communities and the incredible things they've done to leave their lasting impact on society. My name is Adarsh Ramchurn, founder of Ethnically, and each week you'll hear inspiring stories of people who broke down barriers and redefined success. You'll hear stories of resilience, innovation, and the power of community. Whether you're an aspiring creator, entrepreneur, changemaker, or someone who just wants to see a more equitable society, the Ethnically Podcast is your podcast. Make sure to follow the podcast on your preferred podcasting platform so you don't miss an episode. Now, get ready to be inspired by journeys that are anything but ordinary. So, let's get ethnically. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Ethnically Podcast. We are on season 2 of the Ethnically Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to host season 1, and we're here for another year of incredible stories, impactful voices, and interesting people to talk to. And on today's podcast, I'm joined by Amardeep Parmar, who is the co-founder of Bay HQ, a community of British Asian entrepreneurs, investors, operators, and business leaders. It's great to have Amar on the podcast. Amar, how's it going?
Yeah, all good. Great to be here. And my voice is recovered, I think, hopefully.
Yeah, I know you mentioned offline that you were a bit ill and things weren't going to plan, but your voice is back, which is very important for a podcast. Thank you for joining us on Ethnically today, because you're someone who's made such a massive impact in the industry among not just British Asians, but in entrepreneurship in general. So it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. So thank you for joining. To start with, could you share a bit about your background and what led you to found Bay HQ from a very sort of top line basis?
Sure. So I grew up, it's for British Asians. So I grew up in Ilford, which is pretty much as Asian as you can get within London.
Did you know I'm from Ilford as well?
Oh, no, I didn't. So I went to Ilford County, so around the corner.
Wow, that's quite close.
So I grew up in that environment and then went to university, which was totally different. And what I found is as I went through my career, then often in the professional spaces, people are getting pushed down that space, right? So there's loads of us in accounting and tech and places like that. But I never really considered doing my own thing because I had this flight to safety idea, I think, from the community of you get a good job, you go to a good university, that's success. Then I started writing online when I was 29, which is 5 years ago, literally yesterday.
Wait, wow.
I was 28. I've aged myself there yet. Right. So 5 years ago yesterday, started writing online, New Year's resolution, January 2020, just as like a new challenge of I've been always doing stuff on the side because what I did for my job, I was a tech consultant. So part of projects I enjoyed, part I didn't, but it wasn't like I wanted to do it for the rest of my life. It's just you carry on doing it because you're in it, right? And that basically blew up. So over the next year and a half, I was able to quit my job and become a full-time writer. And that opened up a whole new world to me, right? Because I'd had always this space of you just do what everybody else does. And now I was this random guy who quit his job to become a writer, which doesn't normally happen within our community. And once I did that, so a lot of my work was actually more American. So a lot of my audience is American. So it was Silicon Valley, New York. And I started up 2 podcasts in the States. And I had this weird, massive network in the States where everyone was helping me. Everyone was like, oh, you should chat to this person, chat to that person. But lived in London. And at the time, my dad was sick, so I didn't want to leave the country. And he was encouraging me to quit and do my own thing as well. So I had this weird situation where every night I was on Zooms to America, and that's where most of my work was. But all my friends had day jobs. In the daytime, I was free, but I had nothing to do. And in the evenings, I was always on, that's when my emails would come in. So over that year, it became more and more frustrating of how do I actually make entrepreneur friends in the UK? And how do I get people from our community as well? Because I wasn't really relating to most of the people I was working with. And where the big flip came, so I used to do Bhangra, so Punjabi style dance, people don't know it. And one of the people that I did that with 10 years ago, her now husband was in venture capital. So she was like, oh, you guys should chat. And we had that coffee, and then both of us basically ranted about how nobody helps each other from our background and everyone's competing and everyone's stepping on each other. And over time that became, well, why don't we do something about that? Because he's got the investment background. I've got the now media content background. And it was just meant to be a little side thing, to be honest. But when my dad passed away in August 2022, and because of that, that's what flipped it and made it a much bigger mission for me. So now it's the whole idea of, I'm very lucky that my dad encouraged me to do what I'm doing. He encouraged me to do these things, but he was also able to support me. He was an accountant, right? So he could tell me how to do different things. If people don't have that, we can be that community for them. So it's content, events, and opportunities too. So we do mentorship programs, we go to schools, go to universities, and it's all about how do we use this now strong network we have to get those people to give back and help out the people on the way up.
No, that's amazing, fascinating story. And I think it's interesting how you started from writing and doing something kind of part-time outside of what traditional working hours were. And then it's just progressed into something that's an incredible platform for a lot of British Asian entrepreneurs across the country. So kudos to you. It's an amazing journey. You mentioned something really interesting about the challenges of our community, and sometimes we don't like to help each other. Speaking mainly from a British Asian point of view, but I think if you speak to a lot of ethnic communities, you probably have something very similar. So in terms of those challenges, why does Bay HQ look to tackle those? Well, like why is it such a problem that we don't like to help each other?
I think it's always that thing. I've felt that problem myself, right? Of where a lot of people would boast about, oh, I know this person, I know that person, but they wouldn't really connect you, or they wouldn't really get you in the same room, or they wouldn't use those connections for good. It was more about, oh, look at me. And it's trying to work out where that comes from, that mentality, because is it that when we're growing up where there was a scarcity before, and then now it's that case of their aunties, right? Look, comparing like, oh, my son's done this and my son's done that. Or why is it that we haven't helped each other in the same way? And I think within the Asian community, one of the things I think is always been that divide and conquer kind of element, right? We've always been split. So it's based on religion, it's based on nationality, it's based on what state you're from. And it's instead of working together between those different spaces, it's people trying to be better than the other one. And that's something which we did quite intentionally, is rather than make this. So me and my co-founder are both Sikh Punjabi. We could have been like, oh, this is a Punjabi community only. But actually, a lot of the challenges faced is the same. And if we're all fighting each other, then we're just all holding it to the back, rather than, okay, how can this Pakistani person help this Bangladeshi person? How can this Gujarati person help this Punjabi person? And even going wider than that, right, is that if you think about from the perspective, if somebody's biased, then often they don't really know the difference of what you look like, whether you're South Indian or North Indian or whatever it is. So you're facing the same biases, but you're fighting each other. And as well, sometimes the immigrant mentality can be common amongst the different people. And obviously, there's all these different ethnic quirks and cultural quirks between people in that community. But we can focus on the common good rather than what makes us different. And I think what sometimes happens in recent times, everybody's focusing on what makes us different to each other. And because of that, they're not working together as well as they could do.
No, you're right. I think especially in the Asian community, and obviously speaking from someone from the Asian community with an Asian background, like there are so many different forms of Asians, and there's so many different sort of things that do make us different. But kind of a lot of, if I'm speaking from another ethnicity, for example, they'll probably put us all under the same umbrella when we've actually got a lot of differences, and those differences actually kind of make it so that it's more challenging for us to not just get along, but I guess work together, like you mentioned, and sort of collaborate. So it's great that sort of Bay HQ has kind of embedded that in its ethos. I wanted to ask as well, how, in terms of entrepreneurship, why was it entrepreneurship for you that kind of was the thing that you wanted to center Bay HQ around?
It's one of these random flukes, right? Is that when I started writing, my first ever article was about Japanese philosophy. So I did karate for about 15 years. So when I started originally, it was about, okay, I've learned all these things from all these different things I've done in my life. I've read loads of books. How do I try and get clear about what my actual thoughts are? But what happened is, after writing for a few months, I was able to join one of the mastermind groups on the platform I was writing on, so Medium, people have heard of it. And I was now part of this mastermind of the top 50 writers on the platform. And what we used to do is help each other out. So we'd edit each other's articles, give each other feedback. And off the back of that, the guy who was in charge of the main entrepreneurs publication then was like, oh, do you want to come and work for me and edit? So it's like a little side gig I had, right? So all of a sudden now, then 6 months into my writing side hustle career, I was now the editor of this massive publication that got millions of views every month. So I now had this exposure to all of these people submitting their articles for me to read to understand who's the best person, like, or which ones to accept, right? So it was not an intentional thing of 5 years ago. I wanted to do what I'm doing now. It's I gained experience in entrepreneurship space. And because so much of my work was American, then over that next 2.5 years, 3 years, before I started BHQ, I was soaking up all the American knowledge and I could see how Americans did it, which generally is way further ahead of how Brits do it. So the mentality they have about risk and failure is so foreign to somebody who's been born and raised in the UK, but we can use their techniques to really help. And I think it came down to as well, just looking at how many people I saw struggling with this problem of their family don't believe in them, their friends think they're crazy, their friends are like, why are you quitting your job to do this? And the more I talked to people, the more that kept coming up. But I just felt like there was a gap where all of the conversations were complaining and it was like validating each other's insecurities rather than, okay, so how do we bring people together? How do we actually improve this? And that's what we tried to fill that gap of, right? Because it's very easy, and I think it's a British thing, right? You want to complain, you want to rant about things, but there is ways you can work together to make things better. And we wanted to be filling that gap. And we saw that gap of where there just wasn't really anything for it. So there's communities for Black founders, communities for female founders, for LGBTQ founders, and like Asian small businesses, but nothing in the more startup tech space. And that's the bit was like, why is there a gap here?
No, it's incredible to kind of piece everything together, and like those experiences along with what you learned from working at Medium and becoming an editor. I just find it so interesting that the transitions that you made along the way and like how you've been able to navigate the space. And I think you kind of mentioned one thing around sort of agents wanting to criticize and, you know, complain about a lot of things. But I guess what BHQ are doing, not just you guys, but a lot of different community groups and entrepreneur spaces and startups supporting British Asians are kind of empowering the community, which is something that I think, I don't know about you, but would you say like 10, 20 years ago, even to this day, but I mainly think about the last 2 decades in terms of that's something that I've not really seen a lot.
Yeah, I think it's what happened is that when people first moved, like the first wave of people came across it, then the racism and bias was way stronger, right? So like for my dad's generation, you'd get Paki written on your door and you get bricks through your window, which hopefully and thankfully a lot of people in the UK now from ethnic minority backgrounds, other than some like unfortunate instances last year, generally you don't get that same level of like violent racism as you once did on a like mainstream common level. And what then happened is that at that time, those people all worked together. But in a way to get safe is where they were then like integrating. But what sometimes happened is some people would integrate, but then look down on the people who are now coming in. And you've got this weird thing of hierarchy amongst people who are immigrants of looking down on other immigrants. And it's just a negative cycle. And it's one of those things where it's not because anybody is necessarily an evil person, but it's just the way that they try to keep themselves safe and the insecurities they have. It all plays into each other and it creates that toxic environment sometimes. And you see a lot of that intergenerational blame sometimes, I think, amongst Asians. Yeah. My parents are this, my parents are that. But you've got sometimes I think we have to understand like our parents grew up in a much harsher environment than we did. So sometimes that mentality of how the world is now can be held back because they're like, well, when I went to school, then I was like, people treat me like this way or that way. So that's some of the thing now. I think there's this new wave of people in my generation, a bit younger than me as well, who have now got a bit more safety maybe than had before, who now have the freedom because their family, their parents have done well and the parents have been able to give them that security to now take risk again and try to do something different. But it's a mental adjustment that has to happen there too. But I think now there's definitely in the last couple of years, I think hopefully like it's somewhat since we started, is that once people see this wave of things going well, then other people are encouraged to also do things. And you get that spiral effect, right? Because you need somebody in a way to create that gap or create that show that it can be done. And then others are now doing it too. And everyone's kind of taking different areas of where they think there's a gap or where maybe what we do isn't quite suited to what their particular interest is. And then you see like a few people cropping up now, and it's all about longevity, is who's going to stick around and who's going to keep doing it. And that's what really makes a difference, right? Because as everybody knows, it's really exciting to start off an idea, but the real grit is, can you keep it going? Can you keep going even when times are hard?
No, 100%. I think having that sort of community aspect, which is what you guys have built as well, helps that longevity. If you've got people in your network, in your connections that are being entrepreneurs, building their businesses, growing startups, connecting with each other. I think that makes a massive difference. And I think when you talk about entrepreneurship, not just for British Asians, but in general, I feel like when I think of my generation, Gen Z, and the generation below and the generation above, I feel like there is this movement of a lot more people wanting to set up their own, whether it's a business, their passion, being more creative in outside of their work, essentially doing something outside of their work. Not just about around British Asians, but what do you think is the reason why? Because I feel like it seems like everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If anything, that's a really good thing. But what do you think is causing that general, I don't know, growth in that area?
It's the world has changed so much, right? Because let's say the financial crisis thing was the turning point. So 2008 is that up until that point, for a while, people had it good, right? It's like wages were increasing every year. There was opportunities. Whereas once that happened, it kind of showed that you can get this high paying job and it might not work out. And what we're seeing today as well, especially in the last couple of years with AI, it becomes really scary of what do you actually do as a job that can give you a livelihood for the next 10 years. And even say with entrepreneurship, where with what I'm doing with the podcast and what you're doing with the podcast, is that there's now companies like 11x where they can almost do a podcast that's like you already. And I think there's that element of there's so much less certainty in the future. And before, what the case against entrepreneurship is, okay, if you get a good job, then you've got certainty, and that's a huge thing, right? It's having that certainty is, no, okay, I can pay my bills, okay, I'm going to be able to get a mortgage, I can support my family. Whereas when now you see so many jobs becoming like cut down, there's so many redundancies, and the world is less certain. If the general employment world is less certain, then it means that the entrepreneurship side isn't as scary as it once was. Whereas before, entrepreneurship was so much scarier compared to having a safe job. Whereas today is looking at so many different industries and say, okay, where do I see that I can have a job in this industry in 20 years' time? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that. And even as an entrepreneur, you've got to keep adapting and changing, but at least you've got some element of whether it's control, whether you actually got it or not, but you feel like you have. And I think that's partly behind it too, of just knowing it's like you can try things out and the risk of losing a safe job isn't quite what it was before.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think it's more when you see your role models as well in the industry that from British Asian background as well, people like yourself who have gone on that path and have created something, a community, a business. It gives more people more confidence as well, because I feel like you're right in the sense of we kind of lack that ability to take a risk, maybe because of upbringing and our parents' generation and their generation, and kind of having that mindset of they've taken the biggest risk, so there's no need for you to take a risk. Like, we've moved to this country, so you guys just need to settle, and then we can. The idea of risk wasn't really something that was brought about, so I think it's important nowadays that we've got that more people, not just from a British Asian background, but in general, pursuing entrepreneurship.
It's also to say 15 years ago, entrepreneurship wasn't really a thing in terms of nobody really, like, it was a weird thing if you were going to go and quit your job and become an entrepreneur. And in the UK, it's only really in the last 10, 15 years that like venture capital has been a thing really, and scale companies. So say Monzo and companies like that, Revolut.
Yeah.
Before then, like, there wasn't really anybody, like you said, to like look up to or any example of an industry. So we always had the American companies, say Microsoft, Apple. But now you're hearing more about these younger companies that are doing really well, which I guess is why you guys see it. And like, for example, we all had Monzo when we were at university, we all had Revolut. And you're now seeing more and more examples of people who are just starting stuff and it going and expanding.
Yeah, that's so true. There's also the case of the world is becoming, there's more problems in the world, and therefore more people are becoming more creative and have ideas to solve these problems. Like, for example, I mean, the best example I can make is Uber. Like, no one was thinking, oh, imagine there was a marketplace for booking a taxi. No one was thinking that. Someone came up with it because they probably experienced it, and then that's how it's come about. So it just shows that probably there are so many different reasons why more people are getting more confident in entrepreneurship and setting up their own business. You mentioned that you got a podcast, and obviously we're on a podcast, so it'll be rude not to ask you a question about podcasting, because you've had some really interesting guests on the Bay HQ podcast. Your most recent episode, actually, with Sam Benny, I actually met him at an event a couple of months ago. So he's a really interesting speaker, investor, and his story is just super inspiring. But you've spoken with many, many other interesting entrepreneurs, investors from the British Asian community. This is a big question. So, but I hope you can answer it. What are some of the sort of key takeaways you've taken from having these conversations with entrepreneurs on your podcast? Like, what's the thing that really, every time you're getting on the podcast and you're speaking with Sam Benny, for example, or someone else, what's the biggest thing you've taken away?
So I've interviewed over 300 people now, right? So even before BHQ, that was founder of Netflix, founder of Twitter. There's all these people who've done incredible things. Like one person I interviewed has like 10 million followers, for example. One person had saved like hundreds of thousands of refugees' lives. All these people were best in their particular field. I've interviewed so many of them, right? And the thing about all of them is they all eat, sleep, and use the toilet, right? That's me making that PG. But that's the thing. All of them are just people. And they all got insecurities. They've all got worries. They've all got things that you wouldn't expect. They all sometimes binge Netflix, and they all sometimes eat crap food that they shouldn't eat. And what I think happens is until you get to know those people or have that experience, you put them on a pedestal. Yeah. And I think the same thing with me, like, don't put me on a pedestal. I'm just a random moron half the time. But when you know that, then it's like, well, you beat yourself up less. You don't put as many limits on yourself. I think when I was growing up, I thought I could never be like any of these people because you think, oh, they're so amazing. Like I could never do that. And it's like, they all, like, not to put any of them down, they say this themselves. They all make dumb decisions. They all do things wrong. But if you think they're perfect, you don't aspire to be like them because you can't be like them. Whereas when you realize from all these conversations that actually, like, I can chat with them and they're just normal people, I think that's raised my level of what I think is possible for myself so much. I'd say that's the biggest lessons from all of these episodes is I don't put them on a pedestal anymore. I've now learned to just treat them like normal people. And I've grown so much because of that. Because when if there's a challenge, I'm like, yeah, I can do that because why not? And I think when I was younger, I was like, oh no, I can't do that. Like that's what other people do. It's not what somebody like me does. So I'd say that's the biggest takeaway. And if anybody's listening to this, like who's wants to take something away, just like stop putting yourself down. And at the same time, it's also about the relentless and like resourcefulness. Is that so many of them, some people have been on a podcast totally from privilege, right? They had everything handed to them. I won't name any names where they didn't really have to work hard for it. But most of them have had to like go through quite hardships and traumas and things in their life. And when you realize that too, is that a lot of them came from backgrounds where it says one example is Ranbir Arora. So he left school at 16 because he was bullied so heavily that he didn't want to stay on. And then he did odd jobs for 5 years before eventually becoming the founder associate at Sweatcoin. Sweatcoin then grew massively and he's now in charge of a company, his own startup that's got 10 million in revenue in its second year. So that's a dude that when you're at 16, like he's got no hope, right? He's bullied. He's too scared to go to school. He was like an outsider, but look what he's gone and done. And when you see more and more stories of that, again, like you just stop thinking that I can't do this or other people can't do this. And it's like, there's all stuff like little tricks and stuff they do. But actually the reality is that a lot of them, they just kept going when other people gave up.
It's a very important thing that you raised because obviously having the Ethnically podcast and speaking to some really interesting guests myself, I completely agree with you in terms of I actually starting the podcast, I put some of these people on massive pedestals and I was thinking, how can I even be speaking to this person right now? But you do realize that, yeah, they're just normal people. They've made mistakes, but they've gone on to do amazing things. But you're right. I can see where you refrained from swearing and that they eat, sleep and go to the toilet. But I think it's an important message that everyone is just a normal person and they're all trying to, I think one of the biggest things I've learned as well is that no one has it figured out. And I think we have this perception, not just in the Asian community, but I think in general that people that we aspire to be like or who we deem as successful have figured it all out. I've got this master plan, but in reality, I don't think that's the case, right?
I think the other big thing too is, so I've met most influencers, right? Like I know most influencers, I know most of the big entrepreneurs over like that. And sometimes what you don't realize is, I say it like, let's say you're standing next to two buildings. One's the Empire State Building and one, say, is 20 stories high. If you're standing at the bottom on the floor, when you look up, they both look the same. When you're on the 20th floor, you look across it, okay, one's on my level and one's still really high up. The challenge is when you look at social media and looking up people to aspire to there, if you don't know enough, you can sometimes look up to the wrong people. Maybe they're further ahead than you are, but some of the stuff they're saying is completely wrong. And is actually feeding their egos rather than trying to help you. And this one thing to be really careful about with a lot of social media entities and people like that is, why are they doing this? Is it because they're trying to help, or is it because they want to feel important? And one of the big challenges within our community sometimes is the focus on status and impressing other people. And I think the people you really want to follow, the people you really want to learn from, are the ones who aren't living to impress other people. But the challenge is a lot of those people might not create content because they don't need to. They're happy, they're fulfilled. So whenever you're talking to people, it's always be more cautious of people who constantly bring up their achievements when they don't need to, right? It's like, if they've done well for themselves, they will probably often more focused on you and like learning about your story than just bigging themselves up constantly. So the founder of Netflix and Twitter, both of them chatted for me like half an hour for the podcast. I was like, oh, tell me your story. Why do they have to care? They don't have to care. They're way bigger than me, right? But when there's some of these people at the top, they're actually curious. They want to know your story. Whereas some people are like, oh, I won this award and that award. Nobody really cares. Yeah. And the people that do care aren't the ones you should be, like, aren't the ones who really care about you. They just care about your achievements, which is not the same thing.
We see like this conversation around status actually, it's a really important discussion point, because I think if you're at the beginning of your career and you want to progress, or probably you're halfway through your career or maybe starting something new, you're always looking for people who have already done it, or maybe you see as got, probably more experience than you. And I think it's a really important message to say that, again, I'm kind of reiterating what we kind of said, but everyone is just a normal person. But at the same time, there are going to be people that you deem that have higher statuses than you. They just want to learn about you. I've got some similar experiences having hosted the podcast and afterwards speaking to my guests for about 20, 30 minutes about something that they said on the podcast. I was like, oh, could you tell me a bit more about what you meant by that? Or like they wanted to hear what I was doing. So it's definitely something that I think I want to see a lot more, especially in sort of the British Asian community. You mentioned role models and people that kind of have had an influence on you, not just on the podcast, but in sort of your career, in your personal life. And you mentioned your father, who, you mentioned has passed away. So sorry to hear about that. Could you elaborate a little bit on how like his impact on you? Because you mentioned if it wasn't for him, you probably wouldn't have set up AHQ.
Oh, 100%. So it's one of these things of where growing up, I'm so lucky to have had, so I can focus on the fact that I was 30 when my dad passed away. I can focus on that fact of like, poor me, right? And obviously it's been a hard couple of years. But what I try and focus on is like, I'm so lucky to have had him in the first place. The only reason it's hurt me so badly is because I cared about him so much, and I had that relationship with him that he cared about me rather than my success. And that makes me lucky. And I know that there'll be some people listening who didn't have a good relationship with their parents, who maybe didn't have a present parent in their lives. So I'm very, very fortunate. And I think the key thing for me is just that like my dad gave me that space to focus on what he thought was going to make me happy, as opposed to what he thought he could impress his friends with, or what's going to make more money, or whatever it was. So when I was thinking about quitting my job, I was really scared about it, right? Because I've been in the consulting world for 7 years, and I took a week off work in March or February 2021, and I made a PowerPoint presentation and presented it to my family. Okay, I'm thinking about quitting my job. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to try it. This is the revenues, whatever. And my dad at the end was just like, you didn't have to do that. Like you're going to, like, you'll make it work. Like you'll be fine. Like you're going to be happy doing that part. Like go and do it. And I think sometimes the conversation around how Asian parents are, you sometimes don't realize that actually they might really have your back, but sometimes that conversation never happens because you're scared of the conversation. And sometimes like people listening, like, why not just have the conversation and find out? Because your parents might actually really support you, but you've got it in your head, oh, Asian parents don't think like this. And my dad said, like, he came to this country when he was like, he was born in India, came to this country when he was still in primary school. He had to learn how to speak English, all those different challenges. He went to university and like had to struggle there, where he managed to get a professional job as an accountant. He worked his way up, became the person in charge of the overall company, and managed to sell that. But in that entire time, I don't understand how he did it in terms of, I can see how stressed out I get about what I do. But I was like, how the hell do you run like this company? And like when he was at home, he just had this completely relaxed like behavior where it's like, I would never be able to do that. And that's one of the things like I wish I could learn from him, of how he was able to separate things so well. Well, obviously his job was very stressful, but he was able to still be kind and present when he was with us. And we had like letters from people in the community who were like, oh, the only reason like I could feed my kids, the only reason I could have like a roof over my head was because your dad saved my business when you didn't have to. Like he would put in the extra work to like just make sure some of these people who maybe weren't even the highest paying clients, to make sure that they could do that because they grew up where he did. And it's the whole element of, with what I can do today, is that I'm in a different position because I've been able to stand. So I think it's on the £2 coin, right? Standing on the shoulders of giants. Only reason what I'm doing today is my dad gave me this platform. My dad encouraged me to do well. He believed in me, right? And I don't know if I'd ever quit my job if my dad was like, oh, don't be an idiot. Like, why are you quitting your job? So I have like a lot of respect for people who can go against their family wishes and can do that, because I don't know if I would have had the guts myself if I didn't know that my dad was like, yeah, you're going to do this. It would be fine. You'll figure it out. So yeah, I'm very, very lucky to have had that I did.
Yeah, and I'm sure your dad is looking down on you, very proud of you, and for all of the achievements that you've gone on to do and the impact that you're making on a lot of people's lives. And I think there's another conversation around that in terms of, I spoke to Rohit Sagu, who is director of British Sikh Nurses. He's an organization that he runs, and he was speaking about, in the Asian community, we don't speak about death, don't have conversations about what it's like to bereave, what it's like to grieve. We kind of just, in some cases, people, like when death happens in the family, it's kind of like there's a bit of mourning, but there's no legacy, or there's no remembrance of it. And there's no, whilst in other cultures and communities, you can see there's a big sort of emphasis on making sure that we celebrate their life post death. And I think it just that conversation you spoke about your father kind of reminded me of that, because it shows that you've taken his learnings, the lessons that you learn, your conversations, everything, and you've made it into, you've translated it into your everyday life. And I think it's a beautiful thing to hear from you, Amar.
It's one thing I'm very conscious about. I want to make sure that I have a power and a voice. And I know so many people who've lost their parents or lost a parent, but they won't talk about it. And they feel that shame about the sadness and the grief they're feeling. And if people consider me somewhat strong, and I can say about I struggle with grief and how it's affected me, then hopefully for some people listening who maybe are struggling, they can be like, well, actually, I shouldn't shame myself. I shouldn't have to feel bad about this. And it's one way I can kind of see, it's like, I've got a position of relative power or influence. Can I use that to open up that door for that conversation? And it's particularly bad for men's mental health, where Asian men, where it's that whole thing about be the patriarch, be strong, and you've got to look out for everybody else. And what happens, especially in the Punjabi community, is often a lot of people turn to alcohol, they turn to substance abuse as a way of coping, because they're not allowed to show that emotion. And like the stats are all out there, right? There's so many people who are struggling with different things who can't talk about it. And if we allowed men, like obviously men and women, but like men in particular is what I got experience of, is if more of them could just say like, yeah, I'm struggling right now, and have their friends support them, how many lives would be better, right? Because it affects everybody, right? If your parent is mentally ill, but they won't go to for help, that affects the kids, it affects the family, it affects everybody else. So creating that environment where we can all be open about our feelings and not be shamed for that and look out for each other is hopefully something which I can encourage.
Yeah. And there's definitely a lot of education, I think, probably nowadays around mental health, not just that's positively impacting the Asian community, but a lot of other communities where mental health is still a taboo, and a taboo topic that people just don't speak about. And I think particularly the point around men's mental health, and having conversations with your parents, your younger brother, your older brother, especially as men, I think is very important. I think we're getting to a place where the conversation's a lot more mainstream. It's a lot more important, and it, like you said, it saves lives, and it's just super important. I wanted to touch on a couple of other questions, because I think the conversation's just been so interesting. I've learned so much from you, Amar. But I think going back to sort of the goals and aspirations of AHQ in the future, you've obviously built something that is incredible, supporting entrepreneurs from many different backgrounds in the Asian community that are doing probably some incredible things that, I mean, we could do a whole podcast on that. But how do you see your support and your organization, BHQ, sort of, what does it look like in the future? How do you see it evolving to continue making that lasting impact on British Asians?
So one of the things I've always thought about from the beginning is when we get to 5 years, we're 2 years in at the moment, in 5 years' time, once we got to, so 3 more years, I don't want this to be dependent on me. And I think one of the big things for us is like, how do we set this up as an institution that lasts forever, where like in 20 years' time, nobody even knows that I set it up. Because like I go back to the example of Sir Alex Ferguson. So anybody knows football, right? So Alex Ferguson, most successful Premier League manager ever. As soon as he left, like Man United haven't won anything for ages because they didn't set up the underlying systems and processes so that that team could continue to be successful. And I don't want to make that mistake. And I can see many organizations, many founders make that mistake of it's so dependent on the guy who started it or the person who started it. So that's one of the key things for us. Okay, how can we set this up so that it keeps going even if I have to step away, or if my co-founder needs to step away? And in terms of the impact side, that looks like is this year, one of our big things is working with 5 pilot schools to get 100 disadvantaged kids into working with startups for work experience. Because people listening will know is like that work experience when you're 15, 16, 17, that then helps you get into university, helps you get an apprenticeship, whichever path you're going to take. And the challenge is that most people get work experience through their family network. If you don't have a family network, you don't get work experience and you're behind straight away. It's like, how do we fill that gap? So this year is 100, but I want to sit here in 5 years' time and say we've got 100,000 kids going through that. And on that impact side, it's like, how do we build in these systems? And also we've got like a mentorship program. So again, like how do we keep expanding it? I want the ideal path, right? Is that, so in 2 days' time, I'm going to give this talk at a school. Can one of those kids then get work experience through us? Can they then like start going to university, join our events there? Can they then join a startup because of us? Can they then build their own company because of us? And we help them with mentorship, we help them with funding, and they go on to build a company that changes the world. That's the dream, right? Like, how can we set people up from that young age and go with them every step of the way? And then obviously once they get to a stage, they then give back, and it's a cycle, right? You help people reach the top, people want to reach the top, they give back. So in terms of where this is going, it's like there's no limit, right? It's like, how do we keep using the people we get on podcast guests, the people we use at our events to give back and back to the grassroots so we can have everybody rise together?
Yeah, no. So it's about sort of building the foundations for a legacy of impact, essentially, with BHQ. And I think it's important that impact is at the center of what you're doing, because I think a lot of organizations kind of focus on other metrics and such as revenue, money, funding, other sorts of things. And I think impact, when you center your business around impact, everything else sort of falls into place. That's what I've personally believe in and what I've experienced so far in my early career as well. And I think, yeah, just to have that, I mean, you'll probably feel, I don't know, but from our conversation, I can sense that you're probably more satisfied by helping, if you could help one student from a school, from a disadvantaged background, make it to become, I don't know, founder, or make it maybe working in a business, or, you know, their complete outlook on life has changed. I think that means a lot more to you than anything, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the challenges of initiatives this up in the aftermath of grief, right? So now we're 2 years in, it's like, we also need to work out a sustainability element of it, right? Because we need to be able to get the big partnerships, the big sponsorships to keep the business going and growing. And this is one of the interesting things, which is a constant challenge that, like I said, like what I'm learning myself is like, how do we make sure that the impact is the focus, while at the same time making sure we get the big corporates to work with us and the people going to fund us, like patrons, to make sure that money is coming in so we can hire people as well, because that's the interesting challenge. And it's always that thing with impact businesses. We've got to keep iterating and making that model better, because the more funding we have, how to use that effectively as possible to make the most impact we can. And I think people are really surprised about how small we are so far, where we've got 1 full-time employee and 2 or 3 contractors. But in that time, we've had like 2,000 people come to our events. We've been to talks in front of 1,500 school kids. We've done all these different things with such a lean team. But if we got more backing from, say, some of the big corporates, we could do so much more. So it's an interesting game that we're trying to play of, like, what's the right level? Is it a distraction going for that? Is it actually helping? And I don't have an answer yet on that, but as we go, things will adapt and change and keep expanding, hopefully.
No, for sure. I think that's part of the process, isn't it? Of like building a startup, building a business. It's, I guess, over the coming years and months, you're going to be able to sort of have those strategic conversations and build BHQ into even bigger impact even bigger organization than it already is. And I think, yeah, it's impressive how like well and how much, I think, looking at it from an outsider's point of view, seeing, like you mentioned, you've got one full-time employee, you've kind of built BHQ from such a lean model. And I think that shows that if any entrepreneurs or anyone who's aspiring to succeed in business are listening, like you can succeed in your business with the most little resources possible. And I think that's a lesson I'm personally taking on through building this podcast and building this community. But it's definitely hearing it from you as well. It just shows how it's possible, essentially.
I'd say the biggest thing I'd say, like, to anybody as well listening is, again, it's the whole thing about putting limits on yourself, right? It's like, you can, like, I built the website myself. I've done so much of the different random things. I learned how to edit a podcast myself, all these different things. That's why we can do it so lean. So if you put in your head, like, I'm going to need to hire somebody for that because I don't know how to do it, you can probably teach yourself. And if you can teach yourself all these different skills, that's how you can build something without needing loads of money and being able to do it on a lean team. And then over time, you expand the team. But if you try it out first before putting that barrier, like, oh no, I can't do it because I don't know this, learn, back yourself to learn it, right?
Yeah, I'm a massive advocate for that as well, because like you, I've sort of self-taught myself how to set up a podcast. Like 6 months ago, I didn't know what a podcast was, and now I've got my own. So it's kind of, I completely agree in that. There's so much power in learning as well, and I think there's kind of also, I don't want to go back to the cliche, but in that sort of Asian mentality of like, you can always, everyone who's older than you has the most knowledge, but if you can learn and iterate and develop yourself, you can become sort of the most powerful person in the room, have such a massive impact on your career, and potentially shape other people's lives as well. So no, that's really important advice, and thank you for sharing that. We've kind of come towards sort of the near end of the podcast, but I didn't mention to you, Amar, I've got 2 sections of the podcast, which I'm bringing for this season. So last season we had the bonus question, which is when the last guest of the episode before gives a question for the new guest. You've got a really interesting question, but before that we've got a quick fire, rapid fire questions. And I got 3 questions for you. I say rapid fire, because you're the first guest of the season 2. I'll let you take a bit more time, but I've got 3 interesting questions that I think our audience would love to hear your perspective on. So the first question is, what's a book or resource you recommend to aspiring British Asian entrepreneurs?
So the best book on entrepreneurship, I'd say, and the one most recommended, is The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. And the reason why it's most recommended is because it really goes through this less glamorous side of entrepreneurship, because so many people can talk about how amazing things are all the time, but then you also need to know the grit, and you need to know things like, so for example, if you have to fire people, right, that's, you should know about that rather than go in and then have to try and deal with the stress of that. So I'd say Hard Thing About Hard Things is the one that's most recommended. Outside of business, and people a bit further on, is 4,000 Weeks. 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman is one that's had the biggest impact on me personally, but it's not really an entrepreneurship book.
If you don't mind me asking, what's the book about?
So 4,000 Weeks is basically the idea is that we live, no matter what we do in life, we're going to live to about 80-ish roughly, right? If we're lucky. And you can do all the productivity things you want, you can do all of the different things, but you're going to die. And we all die, right? And it's obviously, I agree for my own life. And if you keep putting on this incredible pressure on yourself that you need to do this in order to be successful, it's like, in reality, pretty much all of us aren't going to be remembered in 200 years' time, 300 years' time. And if you keep putting that pressure on yourself, you need to do something perfect, you need to find your purpose, then you're just going to cripple, you're going to paralyze yourself, and you're not going to do anything because you're so worried about doing what's perfect. Whereas instead, if you just focus on what's doing the next good thing in your life is, and what's the next thing that drives your curiosity, you can live a pretty good life. And say, for example, what we're doing is like, we don't really plan massively far in advance. We've got an idea of where we want to go, but I don't have it mapped out for what we're doing every year for the next 5 years. It's, we do think, okay, that mattered, that was good, let's do the next thing. And I think it's very freeing to just realize that you aren't the person who's going to save the world. But if you just try and do the next best good thing you can, and everybody in the world tries to do that, we're all going to live a better life, right? So it's just, don't put too much pressure on yourself, and just try to do something which you think is good, which will help other people.
Nice. Okay, that's cool. I like one on entrepreneurship, and then one that's kind of slightly outside of entrepreneurship, which is a good resource for those that are listening. You actually kind of answered the question, but this is the next rapid fire question. What's the biggest misconception about being an entrepreneur?
I think, I came back to it earlier, is that everybody who's in entrepreneurship, sometimes they've made quite a big decision and gone against their family, gone against their friends. And what can happen is, from an ego perspective, is they try and convince everybody else it's the best decision of their life. And the reality is so many entrepreneurs are really stressed out and they are under a lot of pressure. And for example, 2023, basically every day I'd wake up, my face was tingling from stress, right? And it is not easy at all. And you've got to think about it from the perspective of, is this going to be in long term? But it's also, one of the big things is on that point is that if you try it out and it doesn't work out for you, that's fine. There's so many entrepreneurs who go back to the corporate world. They go back to other things and you never hear those stories because anybody who's done that does it quietly. You hear really loud all the people who quit their jobs to become entrepreneurs. You don't hear the other side. So if you try it out and it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. You can go back and try something else. And there's no shame or failure in that. And the fact that you tried and you've learned skills on that journey, like it means you're better off than people who never tried, right? So I always thought it's like, what's the worst that can happen? Let's say BHQ fails tomorrow. I've learned so much from this journey and I hope I've helped some people. That's better than me having not tried in case I was going to fail.
Yeah, no, indeed. And it's like the saying, like, you've got nothing to lose and everything to gain in doing something like that and set up on your own business. And yeah, you're right. If it doesn't work out, there's so many different options. And I think when one door closes, another door opens. And I think that's a good sort of mindset and mentality to have, especially if you're in entrepreneurship. Because I think it does get glamorized a lot, entrepreneurship. Like you mentioned, people say they quit their jobs, they've gone on to make multi-millions, and it doesn't show you the biggest misconception, which you kind of mentioned. Last rapid fire question before we get on to the bonus part of the podcast. How do you stay motivated and overcome challenges as a founder?
This is one of the really hard things. At the beginning, it's sheer compulsion, right? The only reason I could do what I was doing is because my dad's legacy, and I put so much pressure on myself, right? And it was like crippling amounts of pressure. Whereas now I'm more healthy, I'm more processed. And it's just that next good thing. It's what's the next best thing I can do in my life? What's something good I can do? And if you keep just living life like that, then over time that snowballs and that accumulates. So in terms of how I'm motivated now, is that it's just a challenge. It's just fun. And I'm going to mess up. And because I know I'm going to mess up, then I'm not afraid of that.
No, that's I like that answer. I think if people have a big fear of failure, and I think it's good to embrace that rather than sort of run away from it. So yeah, great answers, Amar, for the rapid fire questions. And now on to sort of the last question of the podcast. Actually, second last question, because you're going to have to provide a question for the next guest. But this question comes from Amit Singh Kali, who is the founder of For Working Parents. It's an organization supporting working parents support their children, maybe they're single working parents, and yeah, great cause. And he was an amazing guest on the last season of the podcast. And his question for you is, have you ever been impacted directly or indirectly by racism or prejudice that has stopped you from being able to achieve any sort of goal that you've had? It's a big question.
So Amit was actually on our mentorship program last year, so I know him quite well.
Oh, wow. Oh, great.
For that question, in terms of racism, it's one of those things where maybe there's indirect racism, but I think sometimes I've been very lucky that I'm just very stubborn. And in some ways with the BHQ, it's not that I felt loads of racism, that's why I created it. It's I could see it was such a blocker about other people. And I had the ability to open up doors for them. But yeah, I've been very fortunate that there's never been a situation where I've been under threat from racism. But I can see so many other people that I am now able to help who do feel that threat, do feel that worry. So I don't think so that I've ever had racism block me. And in a way, that even what we're doing today, it's not because everybody else is evil. It's because I want to build bridges and help people from our community who maybe have had those barriers to get ahead where maybe they wouldn't have done otherwise.
Yeah, and that's a great perspective on it, especially like you said, you're kind of, I won't say oblivious to it, but probably you just don't notice it as much as other people do. And I think, yeah, it's a great way to answer it in terms of you want to support other people who've probably had that experience, and it's probably a big barrier for them. So I think supporting them and ensuring that they can get through that is very important. So thank you for sharing, Amar. Just before we go, are you able to provide a question for the next guest of the podcast, who I'm not going to mention because I just like everything being quite spontaneous and simultaneous. So anything around the theme of ethnically, which is understanding people from ethnic backgrounds, their stories, what makes them tick, why they do what they do, and how they got to where they got to. So if you have a question on any of that sort of topic or realm, that would be great.
So this question comes at the end, right? So what I'd say is, from everything you've said so far, what do you think that maybe you're misleading, or maybe people don't understand about you correctly, that you want to address, and you would say, actually, I've given this impression, but maybe I'm a bit more like this, and we didn't really talk about this, but I think it's important that the audience knows that about me.
Okay, nice. So the next guest will get your question. So we just repeat it one more time, just so I've got it.
So from the episode so far, and the impression you've given, is there any way that you think that might be misleading, and you'd like to correct that and show another side of you that hasn't been shown yet?
Okay, cool. Okay, so it's kind of basically reflecting on the episodes after presenting in it and speaking on it, and then addressing something that may have come across in the episode. That's an interesting question. You're getting them to think about what they've just said and then reflect on it and speak about it. So I like that question. The one thing about this section of the podcast, which I love, is that no one's had a repeat question yet. It's always been a different question, which is something quite crazy. It's quite unique. So yeah, hopefully for season 2 that continues, and we're obviously bringing the rapid fire section to put our speakers, our guests on the spot and kind of learn a bit more about them and what makes them tick. So Amar, I just want to say thank you so much for being the first guest of season 2 of the Ethnically podcast. Thank you for your time, your dedication, sharing a lot of yourself and being vulnerable in certain situations. And when I've asked you some questions, I think that's something that I really do appreciate, because being vulnerable, being so open is so valuable to a lot of people that will be listening. And yeah, your story is amazing. It's inspirational, and I hope a lot of people can take a lot from listening to you. If anyone wanted to sort of connect with you, maybe there's a British Asian entrepreneur or an entrepreneur in general who was inspired by your story, where can they get in touch with you, or how can they connect with you?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say thanks for hosting this as well. You've done a really good job. So congratulations. And you made me feel like, well, I guess I talk anyway, but you've done a very good job of keeping it smooth. So shout out to you.
Appreciate it.
How to keep in touch with me. So BAEHQ, so it's literally, I think it's on my jumper. So BAEHQ is if you want to find out more about the organization. So you can join that. It's all completely free and you get loads of resources. For me, I'm back on Instagram again now, but one of the best places is LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is just my name. So Amardeep Parmar. And I post on that every single day.
Nice. Amazing. So if you're interested in getting in touch with Amar, please do. A link to the website and Amar's details, how you can connect with him, in the podcast description. So if anyone's interested, please have a look up there. Amar, once again, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. Thank you for sharing your stories, your wisdom, your value. And thank you everyone for listening. And there you have it. Another inspiring story on the Ethnically podcast. Wasn't that incredible? If you have enjoyed this episode and have been loving the Ethnically podcast, please give us a rating and review and let us know what you think. Make sure to follow Ethnically on all social media platforms, from LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, or want to join the Ethnically community, or just want to reach out to me, please email me at adarsh.ramchurn@ethnically.co.uk. We've got another inspiring guest lined up on our next episode, so please make sure you hit the subscribe button and stay tuned. Until then, this is your host, Adarsh Ramchurn, signing off from Ethnically.